I found the piece of paper that changed everything inside an old butter cookie tin. Not in a safe, not in a locked drawer. In a cookie tin, the kind with the blue plaid lid that every grandmother in America keeps on the highest kitchen shelf, the one nobody's supposed to touch. Eunice Washington had kept hers on top of the refrigerator for as long as I could remember. 40 years of Sunday dinners in that kitchen, and I never once reached for that tin. I reached for it on a Thursday afternoon in November 2023, 2 weeks after we buried her. Gerald had asked me to go to his mother's house alone to start sorting through her things. "You're better at this than me," he said, squeezing my shoulder before he left that morning. "I'll handle the paperwork at Raymond's office. You handle the house." I kissed his cheek. I told him I'd call if I needed anything. I drove the 12 minutes to Eunice's little yellow house on Delmar Street, let myself in with the spare key she'd given me in 1991, and stood in her kitchen breathing in the smell of her. Old wood, lavender soap, and the faint ghost of every meal she'd ever cooked. I was 63 years old. I had been Helena Mae Washington for 35 of those years. I thought I knew what I was walking into. I was wrong about almost everything. The tin was exactly where it always had been. I only reached for it because I was looking for a box to pack her recipe cards, the ones she kept rubber-banded together in the drawer next to the stove. The tin was the right size. When I lifted it down, it was heavier than it should have been for cookies. I opened the lid. No cookies, just papers, folded small, and at the very bottom, a canceled check. I almost put it back. It felt private, the kind of thing you weren't meant to see. But then I read the name on the check. Raymond Stokes, attorney at law. Amount $47,000. Date March 14th, 2003. I stood in Eunice's kitchen for a long moment, holding that check. March 14th, 2003 was a date I knew by heart. It was the day I gave birth to my son Deshaun, alone, gripping the hand of a labor nurse I'd never met before, while Gerald was supposedly stuck on a double shift at the precinct. 20 years I had believed that story. I turned the check over. On the back, in Eunice's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, in blue ink that had faded to the color of a bruise, $47,000. Paid to keep quiet. God forgive us all. I set the check down on the kitchen counter. I looked out the window above the sink. Outside, 2 doves were on the fence like they always were. The November light was thin and gray. Gerald's car was parked in front of Raymond Stokes' office. I could see it from where I was standing. Raymond's building was 2 blocks down Delmar, close enough that Eunice could have watched it from this same window every day for 20 years. I was a teacher for 38 years, I thought. I spent my whole career teaching children to recognize truth from lies, and I never once recognized that I was living inside one. I folded the check carefully and put it in my coat pocket. Then I sat down at Eunice's kitchen table, put my hands flat on the surface, and let myself understand what I was holding. This was the beginning. Let me tell you who I was before all of this. Not who I became. You'll get to that. I want you to understand who I was, because it matters. It matters for you to love her a little before you watch her fall apart. My name before Gerald was Helena Mae Briggs. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, the 3rd of 6 children. My father, Roosevelt Briggs, was a welder. My mother, Cora, took in sewing and alterations from the dining room table. We were not poor in the way that breaks people, but we were careful. Every dollar had a destination. Every meal was accounted for. What we had in abundance was faith, stubbornness, and the absolute unshakable belief that education was the door out of every room that tried to hold you. I won a full scholarship to Spelman College in 1978. The whole neighborhood treated it like a moon landing. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought over a sweet potato pie. The pastor mentioned my name from the pulpit. My father, who was not a crying man, cried. I studied education. I wanted to teach children, specifically the ones that other teachers sometimes gave up on, the ones who came to school tired and hungry and still trying. I graduated in 1982, moved to Atlanta, and got a job at Jefferson Elementary School on the West Side. I was 22 years old and I thought I could fix things. 38 years later, when I retired, I was still trying. 11 times I was voted favorite teacher of the year. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I was a woman who paid attention. I was a woman who noticed things. I watched children's faces for signs of trouble, for the small lies they told themselves, for the moments when they were struggling and pretending not to be. I was professionally trained to see what people tried to hide, and I did not see what was happening in my own home. That is the thing that will stay with me the longest. Not the betrayal itself. The blindness. I met Gerald Washington at a church picnic in the summer of 1986. He was 29, already a police officer, broad-shouldered with a steady gaze and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was the kind of man that mothers pointed out to their daughters. Dependable, grounded. A man who quoted scripture naturally, not to show off, but because it was actually how he thought. We dated for 2 years. He was patient and kind and genuinely interested in my work in a way that most men weren't. He'd ask about my students by name, remember details, ask follow-up questions weeks later. On our 6th date, he drove 40 minutes out of the city to a field where you could see the stars properly, spread a blanket, and read me Langston Hughes out loud until I was half asleep with my head on his shoulder. I thought, this is a man who will not let me down. We married in June of 1988 at Second Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue, the same church where his parents had married 30 years before. 300 people, white gardenias. My mother cried from the first hymn to the last. In the photographs from that day, Gerald is looking at me the way I always wanted to be looked at. I have spent 35 years looking at those photographs. I believed in them completely. The year 1995 was the year everything I thought I understood about my marriage was quietly, invisibly altered, though I wouldn't know that for another 28 years. In March of 1995, I was 7 months pregnant with Deshawn. Gerald had just been appointed Deputy Chief of Police for Fulton County, a promotion that came with a ceremony, a write-up in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and a new circle of colleagues and advisors, including a sharp-dressed attorney named Raymond Stokes, who had apparently been helpful in navigating the political landscape of the department, according to Gerald. I was proud. I cooked a celebration dinner. I told my students about it the next Monday morning because I wanted them to see that hard work led somewhere. I did not know what the promotion had actually cost. Deshawn arrived on March 14, 1995. I labored for 11 hours. Gerald was not there for any of them. He called at hour 4 to say he was stuck, a situation at the precinct, something he couldn't leave. I said I understood. A labor nurse named Patricia held my hand during the worst of it. When Deshawn finally came into the world and they put him on my chest, I whispered to him, "Your daddy's going to be so sorry he missed this." Gerald arrived 2 hours after the birth. He was apologetic, attentive, brought flowers from the hospital gift shop. He held his son and looked moved. I told myself the story of how hectic his job was and how much he loved us. I told myself that story for 28 years. In 1996, Gerald came home one evening and told me he'd been talking to Raymond Stokes. Raymond had mentioned a little girl at Fulton County's foster care system, 4 years old, no family to speak of. Raymond thought we might consider it. "Her name is Brianna," Gerald said. "Raymond says she's bright. She needs a real home." I was surprised. We hadn't discussed adoption, but I spent my days with children who needed more than they were getting, and the idea of a little girl having a home and 2 parents who could give her one felt right to me. We went through the process quickly, more quickly than I would later understand was normal. Within 4 months, Brianna Washington came to live with us. She was a beautiful child, wide brown eyes, quiet in the way that children are quiet when they've learned early that the world is unpredictable. It took her 6 months to fully relax. When she finally did, when she started leaving her shoes in the middle of the floor and asking for second helpings and falling asleep on the couch during movie nights, I felt like I'd done something genuinely good. I loved Brianna. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came later, whatever I learned, that love was real. It was not strategic. It was not conditional. It was a mother's love, and I gave it freely. I didn't know then why she had really come to us. Gerald was made chief of police in 2001. By that point, Raymond Stokes was a regular presence in our lives. Dinners, holiday parties, the kind of friendship that blurs the line between personal and professional. He was polished, funny, effortlessly charming. His office handled our estate planning, our wills, our insurance beneficiary designations. Gerald said Raymond was the best in the business, and I had no reason to doubt him. Eunice Washington, Gerald's mother, the woman I had loved and cooked beside and sat with in church for 15 years, never quite warmed to Raymond. I noticed it but couldn't explain it. Whenever Raymond's name came up, her expression would flatten slightly. Once, just once, She pulled me aside at a family gathering and said in a low voice, "Helena, that man sold his soul to the devil a long time ago. You watch yourself around him." I laughed gently. "Miss Eunice, you say that about half the deacons at Second Baptist." She didn't laugh back. I should have asked her what she meant. I should have sat down with her, poured her coffee, and asked her to tell me everything she knew. Instead, I let the moment pass because the turkey needed basting and someone was calling my name from the other room. That is one of the things I will always carry. Our life in those years was genuinely full. Gerald was respected, recognized, invited to city council meetings and civic dinners. I was teaching, building something at Jefferson that I believed in, a classroom where children who'd been told they were behind discovered they were not. We had Sunday dinners with Eunice every week. We had Dot Simmons next door, Dorothy, who'd been my neighbor since 1999, and my actual friend since the day she brought over cornbread when I had bronchitis, and stayed to watch 3 episodes of Matlock because I looked like I needed company. Dot was 61, a retired school administrator, recently widowed, sharp as a tack, and funnier than she let most people know. Deshaun grew up steady and smart. He had Gerald's height and my stubbornness and a seriousness that sometimes made him seem older than he was. He chose engineering, University of Georgia, then a job in Houston with a firm that built bridges and highways. He called me every Sunday at 11, without fail. For years, I thought it was devotion. I later understood it was something else. It was a son making sure his mother was still all right. Brianna grew up bright and restless, always wanting more than what was in front of her. More experiences, more recognition, more room. She went into public relations, built a career in Atlanta, and had a social life that ran so fast I sometimes lost track of it. She and Gerald were close in a way that I'd always explained to myself as a daughter and her father. The particular warmth between them. Brianna and Deshaun were polite to each other. Civil, not close. Red flag. I see it now. At the time, I told myself some siblings just aren't close. I told myself it was normal. The honest truth is that I was not looking for things to be wrong. I was 61 years old, recently retired, proud of the family I had helped build, and deeply, genuinely content. Gerald brought me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings. We were planning a trip to New Orleans for our anniversary. Eunice was slowing down but still sharp, still herself. Life felt like a reward after a long time of working for it. And then on a Thursday evening in October 2023, 6 weeks before Eunice would pass away quietly in her sleep, Gerald and I were sitting on the porch. The air had that particular quality Atlanta evenings get in the fall. Still warm, but with a promise of something cooler underneath it. I was holding a glass of sweet tea. Gerald had his hand over mine on the porch railing. 35 years, Helena, he said. You still look like the woman I married. I laughed and told him he needed his glasses checked. He smiled. Inside the house, Eunice was in her chair by the window, and I caught a glimpse of her face through the glass. And for just a moment, she looked not old and peaceful, but something else. Troubled. Like a woman watching something she couldn't stop. I looked away. I went back to my sweet tea and my husband's hand in the beautiful October evening. That was the last night I slept without something sitting heavy in my chest. Eunice passed 6 weeks later. Quietly, the way she had done most things. She'd had a bad heart for years, and the doctors said it was simply time. At the funeral, she lay in a white dress with her hands folded and her face finally, completely still. I held Gerald's arm in the first pew and thought about all the Sundays in her kitchen and all the wisdom she'd passed me in small, quiet ways over the years. I thought about what she'd said about Raymond Stokes years ago. That man sold his soul to the devil a long time ago. Gerald gave a beautiful eulogy. Raymond Stokes sat 3 rows back, in a dark suit, his face appropriately solemn. 2 weeks after the funeral, Gerald asked me to go to Eunice's house alone to start packing her things. You're better at this than me, he said, and I went. Because in 35 years of marriage, I had always been the one who handled the things that required tenderness. That was our arrangement. That was who I was. I drove to Delmar Street. I let myself into the yellow house. I stood in the kitchen that smelled like lavender and old wood and the memory of every Sunday dinner we'd ever shared. I saw the cookie tin on top of the refrigerator. I lifted it down. I opened it. And inside, beneath a folded copy of Eunice's church bulletin from 2019 and a photograph of Gerald as a small boy, at the very bottom of a tin that smelled like butter and secrets, a canceled check. Raymond Stokes, attorney at law. $47,000. March 14th, 2003. And on the back, in blue ink that had faded like an old bruise, $47,000. Paid to keep quiet. God forgive us all. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The doves were on the fence. Gerald's car sat in front of Raymond's office 2 blocks away. And something in me, something that had been sleeping for 35 years, something patient and watchful and waiting, finally woke up. I did not call Gerald. I did not go to Raymond's office. I went home. I sat at my own kitchen table. And for the first time in my marriage, I started paying attention to what I had been choosing not to see. That night, I opened the filing cabinet in Gerald's office, the one he'd always said he handled so I wouldn't have to worry about it. I had never once questioned that. I had a classroom of 30 children and lessons to plan and a life to live, and Gerald said he handled it, so I believed him. 3 hours later, I was sitting on the floor of that office surrounded by papers I had never read, and I understood that the filing cabinet was not the only thing Gerald had been handling. Our house, the house I had lived in for 22 years, the house where I'd planted the rose bushes in the backyard and painted Deshawn's room blue and helped Brianna hang her first college diploma on the wall, was not in my name. It hadn't been since 2018. I had signed a document that year. Gerald said it was a refinancing. Routine, he said. Just sign here, Helena. And I signed because in 30 years of marriage I had never had a reason not to. The house was now titled to Gerald Washington and Brianna Washington, not Helena Mae Washington, not even a little. I put the papers back in the cabinet in the same order I'd found them. I went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Then I opened Gerald's desk drawer looking for a pen and found a second cell phone. The screen lit up when I touched it. One new message from a contact labeled simply B. She doesn't know yet. We're fine. I set the phone back exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, finished my water, went to bed, did not sleep, lay in the dark next to my husband of 35 years, and understood for the first time that I had been sleeping next to a stranger. Not because he was unrecognizable, but because I had never truly looked. I have spent 38 years teaching children that the truth is not always comfortable, but it is always necessary. I believed that. I taught it like a commandment. What I did not fully understand until that November was how long a person can stand at the edge of the truth and find reasons to step back from it. How the mind, even a trained, careful, professional mind, will construct small shelters of doubt and maybe, and there must be an explanation, and live inside them, sometimes for years, because the alternative is too large to hold all at once. I stepped back from the edge for exactly 1 day. The morning after I found the phone, I made Gerald his coffee. I made mine. We sat at the kitchen table together like we had 10,000 mornings before, and I watched him read the news on his tablet, and I looked at the man I had chosen and I thought, there is a reason. There is always a reason. Ask him, and he will explain it, and this will make sense. Gerald looked up and caught me watching him. You sleep okay? He asked. Fine, I said. A little restless. He nodded, went back to his tablet. I drank my coffee and said nothing. And I understood, sitting there in the silence of a morning that looked exactly like every other morning, that I was not going to ask him. Not yet. Not until I knew enough that his explanations couldn't reach me. That was the last morning I let myself be comfortable. I waited until Gerald left for his weekly breakfast with the retired officers group. Every Thursday, 9 to 11, the Waffle House on Cascade. The moment his car turned the corner, I went back into his office. This time I took photographs of everything. Every document in that filing cabinet, every folder, every page. I used my phone and I was methodical. I'd photographed enough student work over the years to know how to do this cleanly. 45 minutes, 312 photographs. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and I went through them. What I found did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers, the way cold water does when you wade in slowly, each step deeper than the last, each one colder than you were ready for. The refinancing paperwork from 2018 was exactly what it looked like. Gerald had transferred the deed into joint ownership between himself and Brianna. My signature appeared on a document titled Consent to Refinance, which was not the same document as the deed transfer, but which had apparently been used, in combination with a separate notarized form I had never seen, to complete the transaction. Someone had been very careful about how they arranged the paperwork. Someone who understood exactly how these things worked. The mortgage was paid. We owned the house free and clear. Gerald and Brianna owned the house free and clear. My name was not on it. I had lived in that house for 22 years and I owned none of it. Eunice Washington's will, dated January 2019, left the entirety of her estate, her house on Delmar Street, her savings account, her personal belongings, to Gerald and Brianna Washington. The document was prepared by Raymond Stokes. Deshawn was not mentioned. I was not mentioned. There was a handwritten note in the margin of the draft copy in Gerald's handwriting. R. Keep it clean. No complications. I sat with that for a long time. No complications. His son, his wife of 31 years at the time that document was signed. No complications. There were bank statements I didn't recognize, an account at a credit union I'd never heard of, statements going back 8 years, irregular deposits ranging from $2,000 to $12,000, totaling, by my rough count, somewhere in the neighborhood of $380,000 over that period. The account was in Gerald's name only. The deposits came from a company called Stokes Legacy Consulting, LLC. I did not know what Stokes Legacy Consulting was. I knew what it sounded like. I closed the filing cabinet. I made myself lunch that I didn't eat. I sat at the table and I thought about Eunice's note. God forgive us all. Not God forgive him. Not God forgive Gerald. All. She had written us all and meant it. She had known. For years, possibly decades, she had known something was wrong and she had kept quiet. Except for the check she kept in the cookie tin, and the one whispered warning she'd given me at a family gathering that I had laughed off and forgotten. She had tried, in her way, to protect me. At the end, it was not enough, but I understood it as the best she could do, and I could not bring myself to be angry at a woman who had just been buried. I called Dorothy Simmons. Dot opened her door before I finished knocking. That is the kind of friend she is. She hears the knock of a woman in trouble from 20 feet away. I sat at her kitchen table. I told her everything: the cookie tin, the check, the filing cabinet, the house, the will, the second phone, all of it. Dot listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. She topped off my coffee twice. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means a person is organizing something important before they speak. Then she said, "Helena, do you remember when you and Gerald took in Brianna?" "Of course." "Do you remember who brought her to you? Who made the connection?" I opened my mouth to say the foster care system, and then stopped. Because I was remembering it now, the actual memory rather than the simplified story I'd filed it under for 27 years. It hadn't been a caseworker who called us. It had been Raymond. Gerald had come home and said Raymond knows of a little girl who needs a home. Raymond had arranged the introduction. Raymond had been present at the first meeting. Raymond had recommended the attorney who handled the adoption paperwork. Raymond had been everywhere. The adoption was sealed, Dot said carefully. My husband Earl, God rest him, he worked at the courthouse for 11 years. He mentioned it once, years ago, because he thought it was unusual. A routine foster adoption doesn't get sealed. There has to be a reason. She held my gaze steadily. She was letting me get there myself. I got there. Dot. I don't know for certain, she said. But I think you need someone who can find out. Dot knew him through her late husband's connections, a former FBI agent who'd gone private, handling exactly the kind of cases that required discretion and the ability to find things that had been deliberately buried. Victor Hargrove was 52 years old, built like someone who had once run toward trouble for a living and still carried that posture even behind a desk. He listened to me for 40 minutes without writing a single note. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. How much time did I have? How much could I spend? And was I prepared for the possibility that what he found would be worse than what I expected? I said, I don't know. Whatever it takes. And yes, he called me 4 days later and asked me to come to his office. Victor had a folder on his desk. He set it in front of me, but kept his hand on it for a moment before sliding it across. Before I show you this, he said, I want you to know that I've done this work for 19 years, and what I found here is among the more deliberate things I've come across. This was not an accident. Every piece of this was a choice. I nodded. He moved his hand. The folder contained a birth certificate, a court record, a photograph of a woman I'd never seen, young, maybe 25, standing in front of a building, and a corporate filing document. Brianna Washington's name at birth, Brianna Elise Stokes. Her father, Raymond Stokes. Her mother, a woman named Angela Durrett, who had died in December 1995 of complications following surgery. Brianna would have been 3 years old. Raymond Stokes had a daughter he could not, or would not, claim publicly, possibly because of his professional reputation, possibly because of circumstances surrounding her mother's death that Victor was still looking into, possibly simply because Raymond Stokes was a man who managed everything from a distance and claimed nothing that cost him. He had arranged for his daughter to be placed in the foster care system. He had then arranged for that daughter to be adopted by a family he controlled, a family headed by a man who owed him significant and ongoing favors. Gerald had known from the beginning. For 27 years, I had raised Raymond Stokes' daughter and called her mine. The sealed adoption record existed because Raymond had used his connections to ensure that the biological father's identity would never surface in routine records checks. I looked at the photograph of Angela Durrett for a long time. Young, dark eyes, a smile that didn't quite reach them. "She looks a little like Brianna," I said. "She does," Victor said quietly. I closed the folder. In the car afterward, I sat for 20 minutes before I could drive. I thought about Brianna at 4 years old, quiet and careful, learning slowly that this new house was safe. I thought about every permission slip I'd signed, every fever I'd stayed up through, every college application essay I'd helped her revise. None of that love was a lie. That was real, but I had been used to give it. I had been placed in a position, without my knowledge or consent, to raise a man's child so that he wouldn't have to, and to ask nothing in return because I didn't know there was anything to ask. That was the layer that made me pull over to the side of the road. That was the layer that made me press my forehead against the steering wheel and stay very still for a long time. That evening I sat in my living room, in Gerald's house, Brianna's house, the house with my roses in the backyard and my name on nothing, and I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. In 35 years of marriage, is there anything that was entirely true? I made myself answer it carefully, without self-pity and without self-deception, the same way I used to make my students answer hard questions about books they'd misread. Go back to the text. What does it actually say? Not what you wanted it to say. What does it actually say? Gerald had loved me, I believed, in whatever way he was capable of. Our life had been real in the sense that we had inhabited it together. The Sunday dinners were real. The porch evenings were real. His hand over mine on the railing in October had felt real. But the architecture underneath all of it had been built to serve his interests and Raymond's, and I had been allowed to believe I was a partner when I was closer to a feature, the respectable schoolteacher wife who gave the household legitimacy and warmth and asked no inconvenient questions because she trusted the man she married. I had trusted him, and he had organized everything around that trust and never once in 35 years chosen to deserve it. I sat with that until it settled into something I could carry. Then I called Dot and asked for Victor's number again. I had more questions that needed answering. I did not make an appointment. I drove to Raymond Stokes' office on a Tuesday morning when I knew Gerald was at the dentist. The building was glass and steel, Midtown Atlanta, the kind of address that was designed to make clients feel that serious, trustworthy people worked inside. The receptionist, young woman, professional, practiced smile, told me Mr. Stokes was with a client. I stood at the front desk and I said, in the voice I had used 38 years for children who were not yet ready to hear what they needed to hear, calm, clear, without anger, without apology. "Please tell Mr. Stokes that Helena Washington is in the lobby. Tell him I have the canceled check from his mother's cookie tin, and I'll be sitting right here." The receptionist blinked. "His mother's cookie tin," I said. "He'll understand." I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. I waited. Raymond Stokes came through the inner door in 85 seconds. I counted. He was 63 years old, well-dressed, silver at the temples, the kind of man who looked like a photograph of trustworthiness. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I watched something move behind his eyes. A calculation, quick and practiced, the kind that happens when a man has spent decades managing situations. He decided on controlled disclosure. I could see him decide it. "Helena, come on back." His office was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood, framed credentials, a window with a view. He sat across from me, and he did not offer me coffee, which told me he'd already decided how long this meeting was going to last. "The check," he said. $47,000, I said. "March 2003. Your name. Eunice's handwriting on the back. I'd like to know what it was for." He was quiet for a moment, organizing. Then, Gerald had a problem in 2002, an internal affairs investigation. Allegations that he'd accepted money from a contractor who was bidding on a department equipment contract. The allegations were accurate. He said it the way you say the weather was poor. Matter of fact, no particular feeling attached. Eunice came to me. She wanted it handled. I knew the investigator. I knew the right people. For $47,000 and Gerald's ongoing cooperation, the investigation was closed and the records were sealed. His ongoing cooperation, I repeated. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that when I needed certain things facilitated over the years, certain arrangements, certain paperwork managed through his office, certain questions not asked, Gerald was available to facilitate them. Like placing your daughter in my home. A pause. Smaller than he intended, but I caught it. Brianna needed a stable home. You and Gerald were— Don't, I said. Not loudly, just don't. Don't explain that to me as if it was an act of kindness. You used my home as a solution to your problem. You used me as a mother for your child without ever telling me I had been chosen for that role. Raymond looked at me steadily. You were good to her. That is not the point, and you know it. He conceded this with a slight movement of his head that might have been a nod. The house, I said. Whose idea was it to take my name off the deed? Gerald's, though I advised the structure. And the money? The deposits from Stokes Legacy Consulting? Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly. Something more like acknowledgement. The moment when a man realizes the person across from him has already done their homework. Consulting fees, he said. For consulting, that never happened. He didn't answer that. I sat for a moment in the quiet of his expensive office, listening to the air conditioning and the distant sound of Atlanta traffic, and I thought about Eunice in her kitchen. That man sold his soul to the devil a long time ago. She had known this man for 20 years and never once let herself be at ease around him. She had kept that check and written those words on the back and hidden it somewhere she knew I would eventually find it. God forgive us all. Not him. All. Why did Eunice keep the check? I asked. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. Because she was Eunice, he said finally. And for the first time in the conversation, he sounded like something other than a man managing a situation. He sounded briefly like someone who had known an old woman with a conscience and had been measured against it and found wanting. I stood up, smoothed my coat. I have one more question. Go ahead. Did Gerald ever love me? Or was I a function? Raymond Stokes looked at me across his dark wood desk and his framed credentials and his window with the view. He did not answer. He was silent for exactly long enough to answer. I picked up my bag. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Stokes. That's the last time it comes to you for free. I walked through his office, through the lobby, past the receptionist who was pretending to look at her screen. I pushed through the glass door into the Atlanta morning. I sat in my car for 45 minutes. I did not cry. I was beyond crying. I was somewhere past it, in a territory that was very quiet and very cold and very clear. When I finally pulled out of the parking garage, I drove not home but south on I-85, toward Houston. I needed to talk to my son. Deshaun opened his apartment door at 11:30 at night and looked at my face and said, "Come in, Mama. I'll put the kettle on." He did not ask what happened. He asked if I was hurt, and when I said not physically, he nodded and went to the kitchen. We sat at his table with mugs of chamomile tea, and I told him what I'd found and what Raymond had told me. Deshaun listened. His face was still in the way it gets when he is keeping himself contained. When I finished, he put down his mug. "Mama," he said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 7 years ago." In 2016, Deshaun had been visiting for Thanksgiving. He'd been using the family computer to print something and had accidentally woken Gerald's email on the screen. He hadn't meant to read it, but the subject line was visible. Will draft, final version. And he had read it. He had seen his name absent. He had seen mine absent. He had seen Brianna listed as primary heir alongside Gerald. He had gone to Gerald directly. Gerald had listened to his son's questions with the patience of a man who had anticipated them, and then had told him, quietly and precisely, that if Deshaun made trouble, Gerald still had connections at enough firms in enough cities that a 30-year-old engineer looking to build his career could find those doors closed in ways that were impossible to trace. He said it nicely, Deshawn told me. His jaw was tight. That was the worst part. He said it like he was giving me advice. Deshawn had believed him. He was 27, 2 years into his first real job, and he had believed that his father had the reach and the willingness to do what he described. So he had said nothing, and he had called me every Sunday since, without fail, to make sure I was still all right. Deshawn, I said. I know, Mama, I know. I should have. Baby. I reached across and put my hand over his. You were trying to protect me the best way you knew how. You were 27 years old and scared. I understand that. He looked down at the table. It wasn't enough. No, I said gently. It wasn't, but that's not your fault to carry. That belongs to your father. He nodded slowly. His eyes were bright, and I understood that my son had been holding this for 7 years. This weight, this guilt, this secret, and carrying it alone because he thought it was the only way to keep me safe. I thought about the note I had written him for the first day of first grade. Nga không phải điều đáng xấu hổ. Nằm im môi la. Falling isn't the shame. Staying down is. He had not stayed down. He had stayed close. That was his version of fighting back, with the tools he had at 27. He reached into a drawer and placed something on the table between us. A piece of paper, folded small, worn at the creases. I unfolded it. My own handwriting. From 2001. Son, there will be days when life knocks you down. Falling is not the shame. Staying down is. Mama Helena, I held that paper, and I felt something that I had not felt since I'd opened the cookie tin. Not cold clarity, not quiet fury, not grief. Resolve. I'm not staying down, I said. Deshawn looked up. I know, he said. What do you need me to do? I drove back to Atlanta the next morning. The highway was wide and early empty, and the sky was that particular pre-dawn dark that exists just before the light decides to come back. I thought about Eunice, keeping that check for 20 years. I thought about Deshawn, calling every Sunday with worry folded inside the words. I thought about Raymond Stokes, silent for exactly long enough to answer my question about Gerald's love. I thought about 40 years of giving myself. To my students, to my family, to a marriage I believed in. And I thought about what it meant that I was still here, still standing, still at 63 years old, capable of fury that did not collapse me, but instead sharpened me into something I had not been before. I thought about my mother, Cora Briggs, sewing at her dining room table at night after the children were in bed, careful with every dollar, careful with every stitch. You finish what you start, Helena Mae, she used to say, but you don't have to finish it the way they intended. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Gerald's driveway, Brianna's driveway, the driveway where my roses were and my name was not, I had made my decision. I was not going to confront Gerald. Not yet. Not until every piece was in place and there was nowhere left for him to maneuver. I was going to be very quiet and very thorough. And when I finally moved, I was going to move in a way that left nothing uncovered. I went inside. Gerald was in the kitchen. He smiled when he saw me. There you are. I was starting to wonder. You sleep okay at Deshawn's? Just fine, I said. Just fine. I poured myself coffee and sat across from my husband and looked at him with everything I now knew behind my eyes and everything I planned behind that, and I smiled back at him. It's good to be home, I said. And I meant something entirely different by it than he understood. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice. It does not break dishes or slam doors or deliver speeches in the rain. It gets up in the morning and makes coffee and sits across from the man who has been lying to it for 35 years and asks him how he slept. And while he answers, it is cataloging, calculating, building something he cannot see and will not see coming until it is already done. I had spent my career recognizing that kind of strength in children who had every reason to give up and didn't. I had written about it in recommendation letters and celebrated it at year-end ceremonies and tried to call it by its right name whenever I saw it. I did not know, until that December, that I had it in me so completely. Gerald never suspected a thing. That was, in its own way, the most clarifying fact of everything that followed. Not the legal victories, not the documents, not the look on his face when the papers were served. What stayed with me longest was how easy it was to sit across from him at dinner every night while everything changed, and how that ease told me something true about how long I had already been invisible in that house. He did not notice because he had not been watching. He had not been watching because he had never needed to. I intended to make that his most expensive mistake. Dot found her. Dot finds everything, eventually. It is her particular gift, the same way some people are gifted with music or numbers. She finds the right person, in the right moment, through the right connection, and she presents them to you without ceremony, the way she presents cornbread. Here, this is what you need. Eat. Evelyn Cross was 49 years old, a partner at a firm in Buckhead that specialized in estate litigation and marital asset recovery. She was the kind of woman who wore her authority quietly. No performance, no theater, just the settled confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades being right in courtrooms and knew it. She listened to my full account without interruption, the way Victor had. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Helena, I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you're describing is not a complicated divorce. It's not even primarily a divorce. What you're describing is a systematic, multi-year campaign to strip you of your marital assets, conducted by your husband in coordination with a licensed attorney who had a fiduciary and ethical obligation to protect your interests. That is fraud. That is potentially criminal conspiracy. And the fact that Raymond Stokes was simultaneously acting as your family's estate planner while facilitating your financial exploitation is a bar violation of the most serious kind. She paused. I want to make sure you're prepared for this to become larger than you may have intended. How large? I asked. Georgia Bar complaint against Stokes. Civil suit for marital asset fraud. We'll go after the house, the hidden account, the will. Criminal referral to the Fulton County DA's office for the bribery cover-up, which is still actionable because of how it was structured. Potentially federal involvement if the wire transfers from Stokes Legacy Consulting cross certain thresholds. She said all of this in the same tone someone might use to describe a grocery list. And Gerald? Gerald is going to have a very difficult year. I thought about March 14th, 1995. Gerald's empty chair in the maternity ward. Patricia, the nurse, holding my hand. Good, I said. Victor had been continuing his background work on Raymond Stokes, and on the 3rd week of December he called me with something he said required a conversation in person. I met him at a coffee shop in Decatur. He was already there when I arrived, coffee untouched, a thin folder on the table. There's a woman named Claudette Monroe, he said. She's been Raymond Stokes' office accountant for 14 years. About 3 months ago, she went on extended medical leave. Stress-related, according to the official paperwork. You spoke to her? Tried to. She shut the door in my face the first time. The second time, I put the photograph of the check on her doorstep with a note. She called me an hour later. He slid the folder across. Inside were printouts, bank transfer records, invoice copies, a spreadsheet that someone had clearly prepared with great care over a long period of time. Claudette has been keeping copies of everything for 11 years, Victor said. Not because she planned to use them, because she was terrified and keeping records felt like the only control she had. I looked at the spreadsheet, column after column. Dates, amounts, account numbers, a description field that read consulting services. Washington over and over across hundreds of rows. $382,000, Victor said, over 15 years, all routed through Stokes Legacy Consulting, which exists solely on paper. No actual consulting services were ever rendered. It's a vehicle for moving money between Raymond and Gerald while maintaining the appearance of legitimate professional fees. Why was Claudette keeping this? Victor was quiet for a moment. Because Raymond was keeping something on her. I met Claudette Monroe on a Wednesday afternoon at Evelyn's office, which felt like neutral ground. She arrived 10 minutes early and was sitting in the waiting area when I got there. 58 years old, a small woman who had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to hold herself carefully because of it. When she saw me, she stood up. Mrs. Washington, I am so sorry. Her voice broke on the last word. Not performance, the kind of break that comes from something that has been held in too long. We sat in Evelyn's conference room. Claudette wrapped both hands around the glass of water Evelyn's assistant had brought and told her story. She had worked for Raymond Stokes since 2009. The financial irregularities, the Stokes Legacy Consulting transfers, The ghost invoices, the parallel accounts, had become visible to her within the first 2 years. She had been careful. She had said nothing and begun keeping copies. In 2013, Raymond had discovered that she knew. He had not threatened her directly. That was not his style. What he had done was invite her to lunch, order her a glass of wine she hadn't asked for, and explain to her, in the warmth of a pleasant midday restaurant, that she was a valued member of his team, and he hoped that would continue to be true, and that he trusted her discretion the same way he hoped she trusted his. It was a threat shaped like a conversation. Claudette had understood it completely. She continued working. She continued keeping copies. She stopped sleeping well. "Why didn't you go to the bar association?" Evelyn asked gently. "Or the police?" Claudette looked at the table. "Because Raymond knew things about my finances. From when I first came to work for him, I'd had some trouble, some debt I wasn't proud of, and I'd borrowed money through his office, which I later realized wasn't structured the way I thought it was. He'd been careful. I was exposed, too, in a way that could look intentional, even though it wasn't." She paused. "And because I had a daughter starting college in 2015, and I was her only support, and I was terrified of losing my job and not being able to pay for it, and I told myself I'd wait until she graduated." "And after she graduated?" Claudette looked up. Her eyes were wet. "He moved the goalposts. There was always another reason to wait. Another thing he knew. Another way I was exposed. That's how it works. By the time you realize you're trapped, you've been trapped for so long that the trap feels like your life." The room was quiet. I thought about what Victor had said when he first told me about her. She was waiting for someone with enough courage to ask. I thought about Eunice's note in the cookie tin. I thought about Deshawn calling every Sunday from Houston. All these people, keeping their pieces of the truth, waiting. "Claudette," I said, "I need you to testify, and I need you to give Evelyn everything you've kept." She looked at me for a long moment. "He'll say I'm lying. He'll say I manufactured the records." "Then we make sure the records speak for themselves," Evelyn said. "And we make sure you have full legal representation and immunity documentation before you say a single public word." Claudette looked down at her hands. Small, careful hands, the hands of a woman who had spent 14 years keeping immaculate records of something she wished she'd never seen. "My daughter is 23 now," she said quietly. "She graduated last spring." "I know," Victor said gently. Claudette nodded once, a small, certain movement. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll do it." December passed. January arrived. Gerald and I celebrated New Year's Eve with Dot and 2 other couples from church. I made sweet potato pie, and Gerald told the story, as he always did, about how we met at the church picnic in 1986, and everyone laughed in the right places, and I sat beside my husband of 35 years and smiled and touched his arm and thought about Evelyn Cross building the legal architecture that would dismantle his life. I had become, in those weeks, a remarkable actress. I do not say this with pride exactly, but I do not say it with shame either. I say it as a fact. I discovered that I could inhabit the surface of my old life completely while everything underneath it was altered, the way a building can look unchanged while its foundation is being replaced. Gerald was, if anything, more attentive than usual in those weeks. Brought me flowers twice. Suggested a trip to Savannah to see my sisters. Talked about spring plans for the garden. I accepted all of it graciously, warmly, and noted each of these gestures in the same mental file where I was noting everything else. The only crack came once, in mid-January, when I was in the kitchen and Gerald came in and found me at the table with a legal pad covered in notes. I had been careless. I'd been working on something for Evelyn and hadn't heard him come in. "Working on something?" he asked. I turned the pad over in a single smooth motion, smiled. "Just some notes for Dot's birthday party, trying to figure out the menu." He nodded, got himself a glass of water, stood at the window for a moment. "Helena," he said with his back to me. We're good, right? You and me?" I looked at the back of his head, the silver at his temples, the particular set of his shoulders that I had known for 35 years. "Of course," I said. "Why would you ask that?" He turned around, looked at me with something that might have been reassurance-seeking or might have been testing. With Gerald, I was no longer certain I could tell the difference. "No reason," he said. "Just checking." "We're fine, Gerald." He nodded, finished his water, left the kitchen. I turned the legal pad back over and kept writing. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I noted with an irony I did not share with anyone, Evelyn Cross filed simultaneously in Fulton County Superior Court the divorce petition, the civil fraud complaint, the motion for emergency asset protection. At the same time, Evelyn submitted the bar complaint against Raymond Stokes to the State Bar of Georgia, with Claudette's full testimony and 11 years of documented records attached. Deshawn in Houston forwarded to the Atlanta Police Department's Office of Professional Standards the email he had screenshot in 2016, the one showing the will draft, and the follow-up email where Gerald had warned him to stay quiet. He also submitted a formal request for review of the 2002 to 2003 internal affairs investigation that had been closed. Victor delivered to the Fulton County DA's office a complete package: the Stokes Legacy Consulting records, the transfer histories, the canceled check, and a timeline connecting the bribery cover-up in 2003 to the ongoing financial arrangements between Gerald and Raymond. It took until noon for Gerald to be served. He was at the barber shop on Cascade Avenue, where he went every other Saturday. The process server found him in the chair with a cape around his shoulders and handed him the envelope with the particular professional neutrality that process servers cultivate. According to Victor's contact, Gerald sat very still for a long moment. Then he asked the barber to give him a minute. He opened the envelope, read the first page, and then he called Raymond Stokes. Raymond did not answer. Raymond was at that moment in a meeting with 2 investigators from the State Bar of Georgia who had arrived at his office without an appointment. Gerald called Raymond 4 more times that afternoon. Raymond did not answer any of them. Brianna called me at 2 o'clock. I was sitting in Evelyn's office, waiting for updates, when my phone lit up with her name. I answered. "Mother." Her voice was sharp with something between anger and fear, the 2 emotions so close together in her that I had always been able to hear both at once. "What is happening? Dad just called me. He said, there are papers. There are lawyers. He said you're—" "Brianna. He's saying you're trying to take the house, that you hired someone to dig up—" "Brianna." I said her name a second time, gently and clearly, the way I used to say it when she was 12 and spinning herself into a panic over something that needed calm. "I need you to listen to me." A pause. The trained response of a child who learned early that when her mother used that tone, it was worth listening. "I know about Raymond Stokes," I said. "I know who he is to you. I know your real name. I know what the sealed adoption record contains and why it was sealed." Silence. Total, absolute silence. "Brianna, you are not responsible for the circumstances of your birth. You are not responsible for what Raymond did or what your father agreed to. Those were choices made by adults before you were old enough to make any choices at all. I want you to hear me say that clearly." A sound came through the phone. Small, caught, the sound of someone who has been holding their breath for longer than they knew. "But I also need you to understand," I continued, "that the house was taken from me without my knowledge. The will was arranged without my knowledge. I was placed in a position of raising a child without being told the full truth of why. Those things have consequences, and those consequences are happening now, not to punish you, to correct what was done to me." A long silence, then very quietly. "Did you ever really love me? Or was I just—" "I loved you," I said immediately and completely. "I love you now. That has never been conditional on anything. But love does not require me to accept being deceived. Those are 2 separate things." Another silence. Longer. "I don't know who I am," she said finally. Her voice was different now, stripped of the sharpness, just young and lost underneath. Whatever performance she had been preparing dissolved. If Raymond is my—" "You are, Brianna," I said. "That part is real. What you do with the rest of it is yours to decide. But you'll have to decide it honestly now. That's all." I heard her breathing, slow, unsteady. "I need to go," she said. "I know. I'm here when you're ready." The line went quiet. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Evelyn, across the desk, was looking at me steadily. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. And I meant it. Not the yes of someone performing composure. The yes of someone who has said what needed to be said and said it truly and can live with every word of it. Gerald called me 3 times that afternoon. I let all 3 go to voicemail. The messages moved from controlled to less controlled. The first formal, the second asking me to call him back, the third simply saying, "Helena, please." He texted the next morning, "Can we meet somewhere? Neutral ground. I just want to talk." I thought about it for a day. Evelyn said it was my choice. Victor said to be careful. Dot said, "Go, Helena. Hear what he says. You've earned the right to hear him try." I texted back, Second Baptist, Sunday after the 10 o'clock service. I chose it deliberately. I have thought since then about whether that was cruel, choosing the place we were married, and I have decided that it was not cruelty but clarity. I wanted Gerald to sit in the weight of what he had built and what he had destroyed, in the same room where he had built it. Victor waited in the parking lot. I went in. Gerald was already there, seated in the third pew from the front on the left side, where we had always sat as a family. He was wearing a gray suit. He looked older than I had ever seen him look, which surprised me. I had expected him to look the same, to be unchanged by being caught, because men like Gerald often are. But he looked tired in a way that went down to the bone. He stood when he saw me. I sat down, one pew between us. He moved to the pew directly in front of me and turned so we were face to face. "Helena." "Gerald." He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I know there's nothing I can say that—" "Then don't say nothing," I said quietly. "Say something real. You owe me that much." He looked at his hands, and then he talked. About 2002, the contractor, the money he'd taken because the promotion hadn't come with the salary increase he'd expected, and he'd been prideful and stupid, and Raymond had been right there offering a solution. About how the solution had come with strings that never stopped tightening. About Brianna, how he'd told himself he was doing a good thing, giving a little girl a home, that it was the one decent part of a bad arrangement. About me. "I told myself you were fine," he said, "that you had what you needed, that you were happy, Helena. You seemed happy. And I convinced myself that meant it was okay, that I wasn't really taking anything from you because you had a good life." "I had a good life built on a foundation you had hollowed out," I said. "You decided what I was allowed to know about my own marriage. You made that decision for me every day for 35 years, and you called it protecting me." He looked up. "Didn't you?" I asked. "Tell yourself you were protecting me?" A pause. "Sometimes." "That's not protection, Gerald. That's control. There's a difference." He had no answer for that. I reached into my bag and placed on the pew between us the note from 2001, the one Deshawn had kept. "Falling is not the shame. Staying down is." "I wrote that for Deshawn's first day of first grade," I said. "He kept it for 22 years. He brought it out last month when I drove to Houston in the middle of the night, because I needed to tell him what I'd found and hear what he'd been keeping." Gerald looked at the paper. Something moved across his face. "He knew," I said. "Your son knew what you were doing, and he was 27 years old, and you threatened his career to keep him quiet. He's been calling me every Sunday for 7 years to make sure I was still all right. Your son has been doing in secret what you should have been doing openly, protecting me, because you wouldn't." Gerald's jaw worked. His eyes were wet. I watched it, and I felt distinctly and honestly, not satisfaction and not triumph, just the particular sadness of watching someone understand, too late, what they have cost themselves. "I am sorry, Helena." "I know you are," I said. "You're sorry the way people are sorry when the consequences arrive. I don't doubt that it's real. I just know it isn't enough, and I think somewhere you know that too." I picked up the note, folded it, put it back in my bag, stood up. "I forgive you, Gerald." He looked up sharply, surprised, as if forgiveness was the last thing he had expected to hear. "Not because you've earned it," I said. "Not because what you did was forgivable in the way that word is usually meant, but because I am 63 years old, and I have worked too hard and lived too fully and loved too genuinely to spend whatever years I have left carrying the weight of your choices inside me. That weight belongs to you. I'm setting it down." He was very still. I smoothed the front of my coat, looked at him one last time, at the man in the gray suit in the third pew of the church where we had married 35 years before. "I genuinely hope you find a way to live with yourself, Gerald. I mean that. I just won't be there while you do it." I walked to the end of the pew, into the aisle, down the length of the church that smelled like wood polish and old hymnals and 35 years of Sunday mornings. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped outside. The February air was cold and clean. Victor's car was in the lot. The bare trees along Auburn Avenue made clean lines against a pale sky. I stopped on the church steps and breathed in. That was the moment. Not the legal victories that came after, not the settlement, not the court dates. That moment standing on the steps of Second Baptist in February, breathing cold air, having said every true thing and kept every piece of myself intact while saying it. That was the moment I understood that I had not just survived this. I had come through it as myself, completely, without compromise. Victor walked over from the parking lot. "How'd it go?" "It's done," I said. He nodded, opened the car door. I got in, pulled my coat around me, watched the church recede through the window as we drove away.